All right, welcome to your first homework assignment of the year. We're going to watch 15 minutes of this video by this professor. She spent the first 7 minutes introducing herself and saying how she came. She's a professor at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. So here she is, talking about how she came to do this work.
In terms of studying math trauma and how I came to do this work, officially I've been studying math trauma for about the last 5 years. But truth be told, I feel like I've been trying to make sense of this phenomenon my whole life. Why it is that math is some people's heaven and other people's hell, their friend, their enemy. Why is it the thing I love and the thing that my sister hates? This is me on the right, my baby sister Wendy on the left. We're 18 months apart. How can it be that two little girls who shared a room their whole lives until they left home, raised by the same parents, had many of the same experiences, the same teachers, how can it be that this subject that I have thrived on my whole life is the thing that still drives her to tears? As recently as Saturday afternoon when I was telling her about this talk. And I asked myself this question a lot growing up. My best friend, my college roommate, my husband, many of my students, especially as a high school teacher. In 2010-11, it just felt like a lot came together that was really pushing me to do something about this particular issue. My middle-level high school folks were reading this book by Judy Willis. If you haven't heard of her, I really encourage you to look up her work. Judy was a neurologist who became a middle school math teacher because of what she was learning in her practice, particularly around how boredom and frustration triggers this fight or flight response in young people. Another thing that was happening that year is my students were writing mathographies, which they always do. I had a lot of students that year, and the collection of mathographies looking at the themes between the pre-service elementary teachers and the pre-service middle school, high school math teachers was really striking. The other thing that happened is that in my algebra geometry class, I had redesigned the syllabus based on student feedback, and some prior students had said, you know, it would be really cool to do trig in this class. That was what they had told me at the end of the class. And so I had redesigned the syllabus so that we could actually touch on trig just a bit at the end, and I'd put the word trigonometry in the syllabus. And as I was sitting with the first section, two people bolted out of the room in tears just looking at the syllabus. We hadn't even really started the class. And the same thing happened in the section, two other sections later in the week. And it was the conversations with those people that I think really pushed me into this realm. So I'm going to be talking to you tonight about data that I've collected, particularly over the last 5 years. Some of it stretches back farther into my career. So student mathographies, some of them are K-12 students, others are undergrads and pre-service, student surveys, professional interviews that I've done in recent years. I was fortunate enough to get a grant last year to go down and spend a couple days at Stanford University working with Joe Bowler, who I'm sure all of you know, and Avita Menon, who is a pediatric neurologist who has done some pretty incredible studies with little second and third graders that we'll talk about before the night's over. Also, as I've begun doing this work, people are beginning to self-identify themselves and contact me and say, hey, Cassie, I want to tell you my math trauma story. And the other piece that has gone on in the background, some of it with the help of some neuroscience majors here at Lewis and Clark on the undergraduate campus, is a systematic review of the math anxiety research that has taken place over the last 60 years. So let's talk about the history of math anxiety, because that's an important place for us to start. I got a copy of this book my first year teaching in San Francisco, which was 30 years ago this coming fall. And Sheila Tobias's book focused very much on the experiences of young women, especially at the college level, and the high incidence of math anxiety in that group and some strategies that they were using at Wesleyan I'm so sorry for anybody who went there, at Wellesley, dealing with some of the math anxiety cases that they were encountering. So this trend dates back to the 1950s. It became very prevalent in the 1970s in the United States with these two psychologists that I have listed here on the slide, and their development of something called the MARS, which is a math anxiety rating scale that is used to this day. Dr. Menon uses it down at Stanford, and he's developed an elementary level one. Decades of research in this area show that the condition, if you will, and I'm making quotes with my fingers here, you can't see me, disproportionately affects folks who have a history of struggle in math, women, students that are low income, non-white students. And perhaps not surprisingly, if we look at all college majors, among college students, undergraduates who major in education report not only the highest incidence of math anxiety, but the greatest levels of math anxiety. So there's some problems with this, and for us, I think, as math educators. One is that...
I'm just pausing. So I think hopefully with the last slide, we're getting a little bit more into, okay, this is the problem that this study is addressing, you know, and something you've heard of. You've heard of math anxiety. Maybe some of you have experienced math anxiety. So, you know, the last slide was about how that whole idea of math anxiety began to be studied, but maybe that doesn't describe the problem completely, this idea of math anxiety. So let's hear a little bit more about that.
All of the theory around math anxiety was actually developed outside of math education. It was developed by psychologists, many of whom had only very limited connections to mathematics education. A lot of the instruments, they predate some of the science that I think has informed our practices the most, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. So things like cognitive science, mindset. The studies tend to label and sort subjects according to their past mathematics experience and achievement. They use the term math aptitude quite a bit, perpetuating these myths about math ability being innate, fixed. And it also continues this deficit thinking that I think we're trying so hard to get away from, but that there's something wrong with the person who's suffering the math anxiety. They need to be fixed. And that's led to the prevalence of self-help books. So I have a whole stack of these in my office. There are so many, and they continue to be written and published. And this is all about how you can help yourself, fix your math problem. So
that's a thought that, like, hey, maybe math anxiety isn't. Maybe math anxiety is something you can do something about, but maybe there's more to it than that. Let's see what's next.
Meanwhile, we have a lot of change that has happened in our midst, particularly with respect to neuroimaging. Neuroimaging actually allows us to see what the brain's doing when we're trying to think about math. It also allows us to see how the brain responds to trauma. We're in an era of Common Core now, year 6, and that's really raised the bar for what we want every child to learn and be able to do mathematically. Not surprisingly, with a couple of decades of Algebra for All, our algebra failure rate remains stubbornly high. It's very much connected to dropout.
So say a little bit about these. I'll say a little bit about these two things. One, you've maybe just heard of Common Core. Basically, it's a nationwide effort to teach in a certain way. And in other words, it's like, yeah, we're trying to raise the bar. Like, what it means to understand math is not just being able to do the problems right. It's being able to explain why you did them right. And then the next point, algebra failure, is something I feel like I've learned a lot about since I became a math teacher, learning that in school after school, all across the country, around 8th or ninth grade, when people hit Algebra 1 for the first time, a lot of them fail. And a lot of them then drop out of high school because they cannot pass an algebra class. And most high schools have that requirement. California certainly does, that you've got to been able to pass Algebra 1 at least to graduate high school. And you know, we're here in Algebra 2. We've gotten past that, but this is a nationwide issue. And what might that cause? Well, it might cause math anxiety. It might cause trauma if it happens to you. So this brings attention to this issue of math trauma. If math trauma is just somebody getting C who wanted to get a B, it's maybe a minor annoyance, but it doesn't actually make anybody turn and take notice. But if it's actually causing people to drop out of high school, well, now we really have to study it some more, and that's what we're doing. We're studying it. All right, let's hear about math negativity and math anxiety.
And math negativity is a cultural norm in the United States. Kids will, we have no problem saying math sucks. We have parents, and any of us who teach math have had the experience of a parent coming in and saying, you know, don't go too hard on my kids because they actually, we're just not good at math in our family. Right? Would they ever say that about reading? Would they ever say, you know, we just can't read? I don't think that would happen. And as the literature has continued and the research has continued, in my opinion, math anxiety is this catch-all phrase that is being used to describe a very wide range of emotional responses. And there's actually some math anxiety that is connected to higher achievement, and that is that little prickle, that little tenseness that maybe gets you on your game before you take a test. But at the other end of the spectrum is what we're going to talk about tonight, because I'm really beginning to feel, as you've already guessed, that math anxiety is just, it's no longer the right term. It's anachronistic. It doesn't match what we're seeing. It doesn't match the kind of negative discourse that's being used to talk about our subject, even by people who teach it. So Joe Bowler has used the term math traumatized for years, just in sort of an offhand way, not from a research perspective. High school and college students who write these mathographies for me often refer to experiences that are painful, damaging, other negative words. I have a colleague here in Portland. She teaches math at the University of Portland, and she actually has her first-year students write about what she calls their prior math abuse as they start their courses. And I don't know of any other subject that is required of all students for so long where there's this kind of language used to describe people's experiences. So this really, it was, when I heard Joe use the word math traumatized, I actually kind of bristled at that word. It made me nervous. I was worried that it was somehow discounting some life and death experiences that other people have had lead to things like PTSD and whatnot. But the more I read the literature, the more I began to feel that no, actually, trauma was perhaps the right word. So I won't read the slides to you, but the idea around trauma, according to the American Psychological Association, is that trauma results from any kind of stressful event that can undermine those feelings of safety. And while they can be life and death, oftentimes they're very much grounded in everyday life. And the most important thing is that it's the person's perception of an experience that determines whether or not it's trauma. So it's that subjective response to something that objectively happened. And interestingly enough, if we look at the characteristics of traumatic events, these are things that happen unexpectedly, happen repeatedly. They often occur in childhood. They involve humiliation or cruelty under circumstances that the person who's experiencing the trauma feels powerless to change or to get away from, to escape. So I think it's not hard for those of us who have been working in the math community for a while to see how math in the United States is pretty ripe for trauma. It's a performance subject. We often...
All right, so I'm going to cut this off because we're running out of time, but you can look at these on your own. So you're seeing how the word trauma is being linked to this whole math anxiety phenomena, and you can decide for yourself, is it an appropriate is this an appropriate way of looking at this? And we'll definitely talk more about it. Uh, have a good night.